Good morning, everyone. I see that everybody's got the drill. Come in, get breakfast, sit down, chat, get up, chat, and then sit back down again. Welcome to our Tuesday morning, Tuesday Forum series. I think everybody knows me by now. I'm Joy Gash. I think we have a couple new folks joining us this morning from Zeeland and Georgetown Township to hear our speaker. So I'd like to welcome them. We are going to get off to our regular start this morning, but I'd like to first thank our sponsor for this event is DeBoer Bauman. George and staff, thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause. And of course, we absolutely need to thank the Grand Haven Area Community Foundation, because without them, this wouldn't be happening. So let's give them a round of applause as well. So this morning is going to be just a little bit different. Our fearless leader in our discussions is in Peru. And hopefully having an absolutely marvelous time. So joining us this morning is Dave Vermilia, who many of you know from our leadership program. He has Edgeline Resources, and he is going to be our facilitator for the morning. So let's give him a round of applause. Thank you, Dave, for agreeing to step in Karen's place this morning. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Hadley Strang, who is going to introduce our speaker this morning. Hadley.
Thank you, Joy. And in the theme of thanks, I would like to thank those who helped plan and put together the Tuesday Forum. So if you were on the planning committee, and I see a few of you in the room, could you please stand? This happened with a lot of conversation and input on what to bring to the community, so they were integral in making that happen. Would also like to thank our students in the room. So any students, please stand. We have our Youth Advisory Council with the Community Foundation, as well as Dennis Threadgood's video production leadership team that's helping with the videos. So thank you to all the students for making the time to be here as well. And now I would like to introduce Norm Van Eeden Petersman. Oops, one second. So Norm is an energetic enthusiast for Strong Towns members' work worldwide. Strong Towns is a for-impact organization that advocates for cities of all sizes to be safe, livable, and inviting. Norm is a skilled communicator and community builder. He leads Deltons for People-Oriented Places, a local conversations group, and is a leader in Strong Towns Toastmasters Club. Today, he will discuss the relevant topics of breaking out of the housing trap. Norm.
It's good to be with you, and I love that you dusted up the place with a little bit of white to make me feel at home. I lived a while back in St. Catharines, Ontario, and so I know what the lake can do and all of the excitement that it brings to daily life. Let's make sure that we're here. Okay. What can be done to provide housing to people across the income spectrum in places where that housing has become scarce, expensive, and hotly contested? And based on the conversations that I've had with a number of you already this morning, I realize I'm in the right place to have this conversation. In fact, the challenge is that this is a conversation that needs to happen across North America. It is in very rare circumstances are we finding that communities have an abundance of housing in most places. It is increasingly a challenge to provide suitable housing that is attainable to people at various levels across the income spectrum. And so that's the question that I want to explore with you this morning. But just briefly, let me tell you a little bit about why I'm fired up about this question. I'm a local advocate in the city of Delta, British Columbia, so at the far end, just outside of Vancouver. And there I'm leading a group that is trying to address our housing shortage. I'm also in the early stages of starting the first new housing co-op in the city in several decades. So if you have any suggestions on how to get that going, please do be in touch, because we're trying to find alternate ways to provide housing for people, for seniors, for those with disabilities within our community. And as a renter, I face the uncertainty of knowing that the house that I live in will eventually be sold, and I will be back looking for a place to live and struggling to do so. Also work for Strong Towns, a nonprofit organization, although I love the phrasing, a for-impact organization that is member-supported and leading an ambitious effort to reform the way that we build neighborhoods and communities across North America. And one of our 5 core campaigns is to embed the practices and principles of incremental housing development into our communities again. The idea that communities need to be gradually growing, gradually thickening up, gradually becoming improved and meeting the needs of residents rather than being frozen, being limited, being suppressed in so many ways. We want this to become part of the DNA of North America's towns and cities again, which, as we'll see in our discussions this afternoon or this morning, this used to be commonplace and now needs to be recovered. And throughout my remarks, I want to keep this core principle in mind. This is a Strong Towns maxim that we use often. We say that no neighborhood should be subject to radical change. And equally so, no neighborhood should be exempted from change. It is essential that we change the narrative in our neighborhoods and communities and at the ballot box to ensure that this core principle becomes uncontroversial and widely accepted. But we're not there yet. And so the promise of today's presentation is that there is a path, a local path, that will allow us to gradually break out of the housing trap. We'll get to it, I promise. But to outline this fully, I want to unpack a core premise. That our current path, meant as a means of securing prosperity for all, has unwittingly trapped us in a system that is incapable of building lasting prosperity and saddles us with a chronic scarcity of attainable housing that will only worsen. What did you hear today? Oh, some really bad news. And tied into that is the acknowledgement of the predicament that we're in. That while we mobilize to turn this ship around, we will seemingly be part of a worsening problem. The housing crisis won't immediately be solved, and attainable housing options won't immediately materialize. There's no button that we can press to help us pop out of the housing trap. But here's a North Star metric that I want to keep before us while arguing for it in the coming hour. The idea being that if we can keep this vision in mind and keep this as our focus, that we will strengthen our communities. And it's this, that the more closely that we can make our neighborhoods resemble traditional neighborhoods built in conformity with age-old development patterns, the more likely it is that we will see a restoration of housing sanity and an escape from the housing trap. I want to start with what anthropologists have called the agriculture trap. And the agriculture trap is rather a simple concept when you see it. The idea is that there's people, and this would have been our ancestors, our forebears long, long ago, and they were hunter-gatherers. And they were gathering food, and they were hunting and supplying for their needs in that way. But then you recognize, you know what, if we just planted food, if we went out and were somehow able to cultivate agriculture, we could get rid of the shortages that we experience. And this shift began as part of what was called the agricultural revolution. There was an understanding we could actually have more capacity in our society. We could have people who did things other than running after lions and buffalo, like maybe make poetry or art or defend us in battles or what have you. And so humans essentially domesticated and started to do agriculture. And the amazing thing about agriculture is that it does create a bountiful surplus in good years. You can have fewer people devoted to food production than in hunter-gatherer societies, and it creates this bounty. But what happens when you create a bounty of food? You wind up actually at the end of the day with more people. And with more people, you need to create more food and create more intensive agriculture and more intensive ways of working the land. And of course, when you do that, you wind up with surplus. And then you get even more people. And the trap here is that at a certain point, you can't go back. At a certain point, you can't decide, you know what, that whole hunter-gatherer thing was a better way to live. In fact, if you look at the history of humanity, after this shift to agriculture, when humans had done this, they actually shrank in stature and the average lifespan shortened. It was actually a more difficult life on average than hunter-gatherers. Communities couldn't follow food when droughts changed their regions. Instead, you remained in place. Instead, you fought over scarce resources. You were vulnerable to weather patterns without an easy answer. But you can't go back. And you can't go back because you'd have to pick the people on the bottom row that you would have to get rid of in order to bring your community back down to the size that you needed it to be. That's why it's called the agriculture trap by anthropologists, because it's a one-way movement. You don't get to run the experiment in different ways. You only get to try it once, and you can't go back. You just have to keep going forward on this new path. This is the analogy that I want us to think about as we talk about a housing trap this morning. Are we able to change course, or are we going to be stuck in our current predicament of major unmet housing needs, escalating prices, and an economy that is so tightly linked to the ups and downs of the housing market that significant price corrections are impossible without devastating consequences? As a renter, I selfishly pray that housing prices will crash back to the levels that they were when my parents first bought a farm. And yet, I know that that would create chaos, madness. It would harm so many people, and so we need to come up with alternatives. But it raises the question, will the pressure just continue to ratchet up, and then what will occur? Will we see widespread populist uprisings? Will we see an uprising of youth? What will we see as we see this pressure continue to increase? And to help us this morning, I want to introduce you to the concept of a complex adaptive system. To help us understand what's going on with our cities, we should think of them as, in terms of this question, are they complicated or are they complex? Are they a part of a complex adaptive system? Think of a rainforest. When you look at a rainforest, it's got all of this different flora and fauna in it. And we recognize that it has a certain order to it as well. But that order is not imposed. The order within a rainforest emerges. It emerges from all of these complex interactions between these different plants, critters, and animals, both above ground as well as below. A complex adaptive system is like a rainforest. We often don't think of human habitat in quite the same way, but we should. When we look at cities from the past, we look at cities that have developed over time and through history. And what we see, if we go visit a European city or an Asian city or a South American city or go visit some of the old settlements in Latin America, what we see are independent actors making decisions, reacting to stresses and opportunities in their environment. And so the cities of the past, when we look at them, we would say they have a beautiful order to them. But that order was rarely imposed. It was mostly organic. It grew out of the environment, it grew out of the place, it grew out of the culture. It grew out of these complex interactions. And complex adaptive systems are different than systems that are merely complicated. If we think of a Rube Goldberg machine, this is a really complicated machine, right? In fact, the complicated part of it, I've tried to create them, and it's maddening to think how much time it takes to set something like that up just right. And we recognize that if you cut just one of those strings, or move one of those blocks, the machine stops working. It just breaks, right? It can't keep on sustaining itself. And this is the difference between systems that are complex and systems that are complicated. Complex systems have this internal capacity to adapt and evolve as different inputs emerge, to change, to respond to stresses and opportunities. Systems that are complicated lack that internal structure. They're rigid. They are more fragile. When we look at a rainforest, we recognize that if in one season a rainforest gets an excessive amount of rain or an excessive amount of sun, it doesn't fail, it doesn't collapse, it evolves, it adapts, it changes, but it'll still be a rainforest. But if we take an Iowa cornfield, and over the course of a season, the cornfield gets too much sun or too much rain, it doesn't adapt and become soybeans or become oats, it just fails. And this is kind of the same thing we see in human habitat. When we build human habitats in neighborhoods that are designed to be adaptable and changeable, that have within them the capacity to evolve over time with an adaptability to the needs that are present within a place. They have an internal strength to them. It might look messy. It might be somewhat more chaotic. And yet it has the capacity to endure in times that are good and times that are bad. But after the Second World War across North America, we launched a system consisting of aggressively simplified neighborhood building in greenfield developments, clear across the United States, and coupled that together with an interstate highway system to expand the access provided by the personal automobile. These two things helped to fuel the fast flurry of home construction and the creation of entirely new communities in places where only rural settlements and farms existed before. They upended the complex adaptive, the incremental, the iterative system. And this was a consequence of policy, subsidies, and a flurry of construction resulting in a dramatically simplified method of building out cities. Everything being built by zoning codes with building codes to support them and basically following a template, following a pattern. So much housing constructed in this way. So many communities drastically changed in this way. And so the housing model that we've grown accustomed to today, a model that Strong Towns describes as the suburban experiment, is a model that is very efficient at replicating itself, much like a cornfield. But in the long scope of human history, it is a model of development that is still in its experimental stage after just 8 decades. And the data coming back on this experiment is not promising. For if we look at cities over time, what we recognize is that the actual pattern of how a city is built was replicated over and over and over again over thousands of years. There's a time-tested wisdom to the way that older cities were established and created, and we upended that and threw that out after the Second World War. And so if we studied ants, we would recognize the structure of an ant colony. We study bees, we would recognize the structure of a beehive. So with human habitat, we would recognize why so many of our cities resemble each other, not in their official styling, but in the ways in which we see streets working and functioning as arteries and capillaries moving people through places, creating new dwelling places for people to call home. Up until the 20th century, you would see cities that began much like this. If I didn't put the text on there, I could probably quiz you, and it would be tough to figure out which of the many communities this might be. This is a rather unremarkable photo of the city of Brainerd, Minnesota in the year that it started in 1871. Brainerd just happens to be where Strong Towns was started, where Chuck Marone, our president and founder, lives. And the remarkable thing about it is just that it's unremarkable. This was a scene that was so similar across North America. Almost every city began in just this way. Some little pop-up shacks, some hopes, some dreams, small investments. And a lot of these places got to this point and actually never got any further. They would fail. That was part of the adaptive system, allowing for failure at the early levels, failure in the initial stages rather than when it's too late, when it's too severe, when it has too great an impact. But oftentimes places like this would start to grow, and they would start to grow in this complex and adaptive way. You would see them grow incrementally out, but also incrementally within more intense. They would replace buildings. They would take a timber structure and replace it with stone. And as the place grew more popular, more people moving there, becoming more valuable, they would create this pressure, a natural pressure, a healthy pressure, to tear down what was there and actually redevelop it into something more substantial. And sometimes fires would do that for us. Sometimes fires or other natural disasters would bring it about, but it would also happen just as the place matured. A general store would add on a second story, or a bank would add on a little bit more. And over time, you would start to see, like a culture growing in a petri dish, this development pattern start to emerge. And so 30 years later, this exact street would transform into something that looked like this. The same street. The city continued to grow up. Notice, not that long after. 1930, continue to grow up, continue to thicken up and become more intensely developed. 2- and 3-story wood structures would be transformed into buildings of brick and granite, the hallmarks of a lasting place, the testimony of banks and other folks with wealth that they were intending to stay and prosper within that place. And this is not abnormal. This is not reserved to Brainerd. This is the development pattern that all of our ancestors around the world would have experienced for thousands and thousands of years. This is the same street today. Something has happened. It's wreaked havoc, not only on this particular street, but also on our housing system and our ability to retain wealth within communities. Let me show you even a little closer to home. This is Grand Rapids. And the traditional development pattern found in almost all cities built before the automobile, as you can see even here, is a deeply resilient, highly financially productive, we would say nearly foolproof way of designing a city. Notice, if you can see in the picture, the mix of sizes and uses. And three particular features that maybe are a little bit tricky to see, but you might see it on your handout in terms of what we see here. There's complexity. Notice how it's the product of thousands of minds and hands and strong backs. The lot coverage. Many, if not most, of the buildings are built out to the property line. I mean, if you bought it, of course you're going to build upon it. And you're going to use that space, but even more critically, not just as a consequence of wanting to use most of your land, you would build to the street because that's where the action was. That's where your connection to the vital arteries within a community was. That's where you would meet your neighbors. That's where you would do commerce. That's where you would build wealth. And then third, you can see it's a little bit more challenging again, but the incremental growth and adaptation. You can see there's a bottom arrow, and I pointed to a place where they merged two structures together. It's an inelegant, messy addition. Some of you builders might say, I probably could have done that better. But critically, this is what the next increment of development looks like. This is what you do when you take a stepped approach to improving your place. Now here's another example in Grand Rapids, and it shows the shift away from a complex adaptive system, 1936 compared to today. And I came across this comparison photo on Pinterest of all places, and there was an intriguing comment attached to it. Someone said, if any trend is visible here, I'd say it's that things seem to have become more boring looking. But I suppose that's coming from the point of view of somebody that prefers old-timey stuff. But it's not just nostalgia speaking. Remember what I said about complex places as vibrant mixes of uses, ages of structure, types of people. We instead created a machine that limits complexity through rigid zoning, segregated uses, a nonchalant ambivalence around street design standards, and a potential draining insistence on front setbacks that limit the engagement with the street. How different that is with the traditional development pattern visible in Grand Rapids in 1870. For traditional cities were well-adapted human habitat. What faraway and economically different places have in common are those sidewalk-level design features common to the traditional development pattern. Go for a walk. Ask yourself, is this sidewalk directly bringing me into the places that I need to be? Is this sidewalk contributing to my ability to quickly move through a community in a way that's dignified, that's honored, in a way in which I feel like I am part of this whole fabric of the community? Or do you feel like a second-class person on the street? Notice what we see in the traditional development pattern. Smaller storefronts, narrow streets, granularity. I am hopeful that our contemporary planning departments are beginning to understand what it means when we say no assembly required, when it comes to allowing more fine-grained urbanism within our communities. But notice in this photo, just all the homes of different shapes and sizes and years of construction, gradually turning over and thickening through new investments. As Patrick Condon describes it, hiving and barnacling. That is, hiving is seeing the existing homes divided to become duplexes or triplexes. And barnacling is additions being added, backyard coach houses being built, street front storefronts being added, houses converting a main floor into a dentist's office and a hotel on the second and third floor. These were all commonplace and have become so difficult to do. I could probably ask some of you your war stories, and you tell me how long it took to add a hotel on a second or third story, or to turn a house into a dentist office, or to add a street front storefront, if you even do such things, even though we need them. And so when we look at cities of this pattern, what we see is that they have an internal adaptability and flexibility. And as we talk about at Strong Towns, they have an internal strength to them. There's a certain level of wealth and productivity that exists in places like this that make them very stable over time. And if we were to define them in a sense of social mobility, which is a key part of this question here, as I've talked with already a number of people who've said, my son can't afford to buy a place, or my daughter is trying to figure out what to do about housing because there's just no way to get started. Think about that from this perspective. That if we were to define our cities in the sense of social mobility, what you have in a city like this, even there, where off in the distance you can see the more built up, more wealthy areas, and then the further away you get from that core is where the poorer people are. That's what a traditional city is in terms of its ultimate layout. The nearer to the center, the greater the value of the land and structures because of their proximity to the heart of the community, with its economic engines and people. The desirable places to live would have been within the core of the community. And you can think about that in two different ways. One would be a negative way that says, you think of the poor people being on the outskirts, the wealthy people are on the inside, kind of like a castle with its walls, and if you're left outside, you're nothing, and if you're left inside, you're something. There's a certain classist kind of system here. But there's another way to look at this, and I want to throw this out there. I want you to have this in the back of your mind as we have this discussion today. Because one of the challenges that we have today is finding places for people, particularly people who are struggling, within the society that we've set up. If you were on the outskirts of this city, if you moved to a city that was growing, where would you go to find cheap land? You would go to the outskirts of town. But I checked on Zillow, the outskirts of town here is where you pay the most for properties. Where you pay the most for properties that cannot ever be, it seems, subdivided to become something smaller, something a slightly lesser increment so that a new participant in the system can partake. Instead, you have large lots that are confined and required to be large lots. I said to Joy, we have subdivisions that can no longer be subdivided because we've locked things into place. And think of it for those that are struggling. Think of those that you want to help. Where would you look if you were poor? You would look to the outskirts of town. You wouldn't enjoy many city services. The fire brigade wouldn't make it out to you. You'd be responsible for your own sewer. But you could also get a chance to get started for not much money. And what would happen if the system was successful? If you and your neighbors wound up being able to work together and build a place that had value, what would happen to your personal investment? Well, it would grow, right? This is the equivalent of the hunter-gatherer society that preceded the agricultural revolution. Because as the city would grow incrementally out, incrementally up, and become incrementally more intense, that next layer of outgrowth would be out on the edge of town beyond you. And so you would be able to be closer to the action, closer to the middle, and your wealth would increase. And if we go look at the neighborhoods that were second generation and third generation of cities like this, what we see is a lot of homes that were very small starter homes to begin. And then they were added onto, torn down and rebuilt with new prosperity that someone had. My family, we grew up in a small CB rail house, a tiny little house, and after some time, as our farm became more established, we were able to tear that down and build a slightly larger home. That would have been part of that process, the natural evolution of places. And so the traditional development pattern did have a certain class structure to it. It had a certain stability to it that could be repressive in its financial makeup. But if people worked together and the place continued to be successful, it had a system where you could start with nothing and end up with something through your own efforts and your cooperation with those around you. In other words, it was a complex adaptive system evolved for us as humans. This is what cities and towns and communities looked like for thousands of years. And no one was trapped by runaway prices that will not come down. And tell that story because when we got to the Great Depression, a shift in outlook took hold. This was sort of the setup. This is the foundational moment when the housing trap was set. And another key shift occurred at the end of World War II, but I want to begin with the question of the Great Depression, what we went through as a nation, or as a continent in this nation. Back then, when you got a loan from a local bank for a mortgage, they might give you a rate as if it was financed over 30 years, But it had, as if you've studied the period, you know that places had this expectation that someone would come to the bank every 3 years with a balloon payment or be able to refinance at that point. And the local lenders, the banks at the local level, were not able to take on long-term interest rate risk, and so they had very short terms on home mortgages. And if you think of a family entering into the Great Depression, and they had 20% down on their home, and they financed it for 3 or 4 years, then their home was at this value. All of a sudden, the Depression hit, and because of all the foreclosures, because of people losing their homes, it dropped to this value. And the bank began to look at that and say, well, we loaned you this much, but your house is not worth this much. We can only loan you this much money, and you need to come up with the rest. And families that could have easily continued to make their payments could not make these lump sum payments that were part of their loan. And so what happened is, as we know, a lot of people got kicked out of their homes. A lot of people that would otherwise have been able to still bring in enough income to make the payments were instead unable to come up with cash up front to cover the difference in their loan value, and because of the way that things were financed, they were not able to stay in their homes. In the US, the federal government stepped in with the homeowner loan program. The government went to banks in the first iteration of the program and they said, look, give them that loan. We will insure it. Seems so good. We'll insure it. If they default, we'll make good on that. Give them that loan. We want to stop this downward spiral. We have to. And in order to do that, we're going to keep people in their homes, because the worst thing that can happen in a downturn of a housing crash is to have more and more and more houses on the market. Think of 2008 as there was a downward spiral. But in the time of the Great Depression, the federal government stepped in to arrest that. It went and created what today is called the secondary market for mortgages, so that the bank at the local level could have that mortgage insured, so that they could say, look, we'll give you a 30-year loan and not worry about you defaulting, so that it wouldn't upend the finances of the local bank. But the local lender didn't want to hold that loan for 30 years. Even if it was an insured loan, they didn't want to hold on to that loan for 30 years, because if the interest rates were to rise, they would want money again in hand to be able to loan out to a new person. And so instead, they were able to take these loans through a program called Fannie Mae and begin to buy them, create the secondary market for mortgages, a program that secured home mortgages for qualified properties. Now, qualified properties was, you should put a large asterisk beside it. It meant we like your place, but for you, if you live in a certain neighborhood, if we redlined your neighborhood, we don't like your neighborhood, we'll do that over here, but not over here. We know what the consequences for racialized communities were because of these built-in systems of exclusion and unequal opportunities. But what it meant is that if you had a qualifying loan as a bank, you could write that loan and then sell it to the federal government. They would take it off your hands as the local bank, and you could go make another loan and another loan and another loan, and these were the tools designed to stop decline. And it worked, largely. It worked. But this is where the trap is set. Because what we did is we stepped in, and in a very logical, compassionate way, we said, we're going to stop this situation from becoming any worse. But here's the problem. Fannie Mae took the risk off the local lender, and longer-term loans made it easier to come up with funds to buy a home. When you add those things up, and you dispense with risk and vulnerability. But this just intensifies the consequence of whatever corrections you've avoided trying to make for a while. To do that is to disrupt the complex adaptive system and insert just a rigidity to it that will not allow it to fail until the failure becomes catastrophic. With World War I, so after the Depression, then you get into the situation of World War II. With World War I, right up to the last 6 months, nobody knew who would win. It could have gone either way. But World War II was not like that, as historians have pointed out. The US government recognized early on that the Allies were going to win that war soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor, particularly with the success of D-Day. And for World War II, it was clear which side would eventually prevail. It was just a question of how long and how much it would cost. And so what happened is during the war in 1942, 1943, the economists around FDR started to plan for what would happen after the war. What are we going to do after the war, they asked. And Paul Samuelson, one of the economists in the White House, said, were the war to end suddenly, there would be ushered in the greatest period of unemployment and industrial dislocation which any economy has ever faced. The thought was, when we bring these millions of men home back from the front lines, when we demobilize all the industries that are building ships and bombs and tanks and all this, and we shut it all down because there's no more need for it, we're just going to go right back to 1935. We're going to crash this country's economy again. After all, nothing had changed about the economy in any significant way. Now, did the U.S. go right back? No, of course not. What did the U.S. and even Canada do? Something very different. The housing trap was set in the 1930s when we changed the way that we financed what local home construction consisted of. But after World War II is where we got in deep. What the White House realized coming out of World War II was that the tools that served the country or saved the country from its downward spiral in the Great Depression, these economic tools, creating a secondary market for home mortgages to backstop home prices, and adding on a lot of major public spending, the tools that arrested the decline, which are credited with stopping the decline of the United States, those same tools could work really, really well to juice the economy the other way. By pumping more money into that system and having more homes created and more homes put onto a secondary market and making that secondary market bigger and bigger and bigger and providing mortgage subsidies and fueling the industry and fueling the construction of what felt like almost a brand new nation with money to build roads and build infrastructure, to really juice this system and use the same tools that kept it from going down to flip those tools around and use them to make it go up. And that's what we did. We started this new project to build a new version of living across this entire continent using these same tools. But instead of using it to arrest decline, we used it to juice growth. This was massively successful. You can have your own house, you can have a car, you can commute, and you can have a high standard of living, depending on your color. But Nixon and Khrushchev met in the 70s. Just 20 years later, 15 years after the end of the war. And they had this debate in Moscow in 1959, 15 years after the drawdown of the US and Soviet war effort. And it was called the kitchen debate. And what they were doing as they debated in Moscow was comparing the first generation of American suburban expansion to essentially the first generation after the Soviets took firm control under Stalin. And Nixon was pointing out in the debate just what the average US family had. We have refrigerators, we have televisions, we have big cars, we have big houses. We grew and grew and grew and grew that organic system. Inputs of federal money and unleashed outward expansion of cities and towns. Critically, disrupting the cycles of investment within cities and towns and sending a flood of resources to the outskirts of every community across the country. And it started out with the observation that complex adaptive growth, incremental growth, was replaced with a system that just grew without constraint and without being responsive to feedback. This is a map of Fresno, California in 1897. And I'm going to show you because it tells you a story that I think will resonate with you or be familiar to you as well. What you see in this tiny little box, or I didn't put it in the slides, just I gave you the last one, but you see that just a tiny little yellow section in the middle is where the extent of Fresno was in 1897. And as we start moving forward in time, I want you to watch how the boundaries of Fresno grow. So now you've got a new area that's been carved out. We're in this complex adaptive environment, and the city is growing incrementally up and then also incrementally out. 1922. It's thickening up. It's becoming incrementally more intense. Now we're in the mid-30s, the depths of the Great Depression, but still there's some growth. And now we're at the end of World War II. This is that culture growing in a petri dish and creating and sustaining and storing wealth in this place. But then, after World War II, cities became, by design, kinetic growth machines. We're going to pump all of this energy into building this new version of America, and watch what happens. 1958, 1979, 1983, here's the mid-90s. Oh, and then the last one here is, I missed the 2010 slide. But a massive shift from complex and adaptive to merely complicated, from a system that grew like a rainforest to a system that now grows like a cornfield, just replicating itself over and over and over. And again, Fresno is not alone in this. The standards that we put in place for zoning and building and street development and infrastructure were all designed to replicate a process over and over and over. A very simple process of building single-family homes and building them out on the outskirts of town and providing all of the services that they would require up front, building communities up all at once into a finished state. And over time, even though it brought tremendous amounts of growth, particularly in the early decades, which is what Nixon was banking on as he was explaining how luxurious everyone in America had it, over time we found it difficult to sustain this pattern. Just like an agriculture diet changed human lifespans and shrunk their average heights, the flattening out of cities and towns has broken them. And so let me make the case for why we need to break out of this trap. A twofold trap of major public investment continuing to pour into our communities and a trap of continued financing that depends upon increases in property values, increases in home prices to the exclusion of others. We need to return to a traditional development pattern found in almost all cities built before the automobile, a deeply resilient, highly financially productive, nearly foolproof way of designing a city. Places that endure not for 10 or 20 years, but for centuries, seem to have a set of things in common. And we'd be foolish not to humble ourselves to learn that. We do well to learn housing lessons along with economic development lessons from the cities and towns of our ancestors. I want to give you some data from Lafayette, Louisiana to demonstrate this. The Strong Towns team demonstrated this. And what we found is that from the end of World War II to 2015, when we did this project, Lafayette had grown from a little over 33,000 people to a little over 120,000. Maybe in the back of your mind, you're thinking this about the Fresno example. Well, Norm, they added more people. That's why the city grew. Well, yes, and so did Lafayette. The city grew by 3.5 times. That's a huge rate of growth. But in order to experience that growth, they had to grow their liabilities by many times more than that. At the end of World War II, it took 5 feet of pipe per person to provide drinking water for the people of Lafayette. By the mid-2000s, it took 10 times that amount. We see the same thing with fire protection. At the end of World War II, it took 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people. Today, it takes 21 times that. And so much like in Fresno, much like in this community, our population has grown, our city boundaries have grown, but our liabilities have grown even more. Ask your city engineering department, how are you doing on deferred maintenance? And you'll see them gray before your eyes. The amount of stuff that we have in the ground to fix and maintain and take care of has grown exponentially. Another challenge is that low interest rates have been part of this trap. Our governments have borrowed extensively to build nice things, to make sure that our outlying regions, even those places, have continued service. But they've built nice things in places that don't have the underlying wealth generation capacity to cover the newly imposed costs of maintaining and improving these things. Since the 90s, in order to boost the economy, in order to boost housing, we kept lowering interest rates to get more going. And now we're forced, because of inflation, to raise rates, yet we're in the trap, because if you talk to anyone, they say rates just can't go up. We can't have housing prices go down 40%, 50%, 60%. But we can't not raise interest rates either. This is part of the trap. Can prices go down? No, because when prices go down, everything goes bad. This is one of the reasons why large money investors have entered the housing market with real estate investment trusts, is that they recognize that housing is a sure bet. Housing prices cannot fall without causing mass social destruction. And so they're profiting from the housing trap and content to engineer its furtherance. And so you kind of have to pick your poison a little bit. Do we want everyone to be broke because you can't afford anything because of inflation? Or do we allow housing costs or housing prices to fall? Do we make almost everybody broke because we're going to destroy their housing value? It's a trap and we're stuck. Stopping the housing market from declining felt like the right thing to do to turn the tide of the Great Depression. Turning that around and using it to juice prosperity at the end of World War II also kind of feels like maybe the right thing to do. But at what point does it cross a line and become clear that it's not the right thing to do anymore? You plant a field so that you can care for your family, and all of a sudden, 500 years later, you're trapped in agriculture and you can't go back. Even though in the agricultural system, people were sicker, people were shorter, people were more malnourished than they'd ever been, yet it was a trap. They could not go back. And with housing, when does this become apparent? And here's the thing, I don't know when we will realize this. But all I know today is that we are stuck. And we're stuck because at the end of the day, we have to deal with this. And in our system, when we step back, we recognize that housing serves two functions, right? The primary function of housing comes from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It is shelter, a place for us to go and get out of the elements, to eat food, to commune, to watch reality TV. That's what we need. So housing serves a function as shelter. But it also, in our society now, remember, we've set this up in our trap to juice the economy. It serves as a function of investment. And those two functions are at odds with each other because the more housing functions as an investment, the less it is capable of functioning as shelter. Or the more out of reach it is as shelter for many people. This is why for the housing co-op that I'm starting in my community, our slogan is no profits, just homes. Trying to upend the assumptions that so many people have about housing and creating opportunities for people to find a place to live. And so if we look at who benefits from artificially, how did I lose that slide? I lost the slide. All right. Who benefits from artificially elevated housing prices? A lot of people. This is part of the trap. Local government benefits when housing prices are high because they get more property taxes. State government, federal government, existing homeowners. All of you all sitting on your nest eggs, you're quite okay with high housing prices. It feels good when you're a homeowner, when your value goes up, right? And in fact, a lot of people feel that they are the smart person because they made a smart investment. There's a sense in which it stokes your ego. It gives you that great sense of boldness. Oh yes, I've done a good thing. Look at me. I'm worth 200 or 500 or 1 million because of my home. Banks, insurance companies depend on housing prices being high. Elected officials prefer it too. Governments bring home land transfer taxes and sales taxes, so long as the system keeps creating opportunities for growth. Developers, land speculators, realtors, pension funds benefit, and basically anything that is an investment benefits from rising housing prices. But who doesn't benefit? Renters and the poor. Renters and the poor don't benefit. And here's the thing about the housing trap. The housing trap is making more of us poor. That's the conundrum, right? That's the conundrum. We need it to go up, and it benefits a lot of people that it goes up. But as it goes up, more and more people slide into that poor category. And there's a huge generational gap emerging as well. My colleague Daniel introduced me to this startling slide of U.S. home prices from January 2002 to January 2022. And the red section, that is homes under $200,000, would be what we'd consider the first rung of the housing ladder. The first rung of the housing ladder that I was told I should get onto. Only that rung vanished. And it's not there anymore. And the next rung is quickly vanishing as well. And as a consequence, all of the new development on the outskirts of town, where in the traditional development, the opportunities would exist to buy a simple home, a shotgun house, a shack, a converted barn, all of those things. Now what do we subsidize and what do we insist that we build out there? Top of the line homes, the blue homes, the purple homes on that chart. None of the red ones, none of the orange ones, none of the yellow ones even. And so I want to talk about what we do. What do we do about this? Because at the end of the day, what we're seeing is a complicated system that is not able to adapt to changing conditions. And I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that I have a silver bullet solution. There is no such thing. But I'm going to tell you is that I have an approach that will help us to get towards an answer. We need to get back to a complex system, one that is actually responsive to people at the local level, one that works from the bottom up to balance many competing needs. We need to deliver an ample amount of housing to people at prices they can afford, and that can only happen from the bottom up. We talk in Strong Towns about unleashing a swarm of small-scale developers. And I want you to think about what it takes to stifle a small-scale developer. Someone that is doing a project on evenings and weekends. Do you think time delays stifle them? Do you think having to go through permitting processes that are totally new to them? Do you think all of the barriers that we place in front of them, do you think that these are the ways in which we stifle that first increment of development? The first opportunity somebody has to build something. That first opportunity that someone has to adapt their home, rent out half of it, use the funds from that to purchase some new property or take on some new project. All of the things that create that complex adaptive system where you have thousands of hands and thousands of strong backs creating prosperity. Now you need a bachelor's degree in many places. You need many other requirements. You need an advanced degree in English literacy to understand the zoning codes and the bylaws and all of the things that are required of you. We need to deliver this by bottom-up strategies. And so what we'll touch on are a few strategies that we can use to create that local restart these local feedback loops and create local economic ecosystems. And the first one is this. Universal statement that we have at Strong Towns that we've come to recognize applies everywhere. We need to allow the next increment of housing intensity by right in every neighborhood, always. And I've just a little bit of jargon there. Let me break that down a touch when I say something by right. What I'm saying is a minimum amount of regulatory friction. You should be able to go into City Hall at 9 a.m. with a completed permit application and walk out by noon with a permit. You shouldn't have to go beg from commissions or do all kinds of public hearings or do public engagement to do simple things. By right, you should be allowed to build to the next increment of housing intensity. This is key. This is where the new trend to legalize duplexes and accessory dwelling units. I think the state capital is dealing with this right now. Utah has done this, Colorado, Oregon, California, British Columbia, and more places are catching on. They're realizing we need to allow gentle density, the first increment. Duplexes, accessory dwelling units, even modest apartments and courtyard cottages. They're so valuable. It sets in motion a process that allows the next increment by right. The reason why we insist it should happen as the next increment by right is that in a decade or two from now, the very places that said duplexes and ADUs are allowed will be embroiled in battles over more density. You see this in the city of Vancouver as an example, where the city of Vancouver was allowing up to 3 units per property. Well, I should say 3 homes. These are homes per property. And now there's a new battle and a new big fight, and they finally passed that you could have up to 6 homes per property. Each generation should be seeing that it happens by right, that it happens in the next increment. Whereas an incremental approach sets in motion a stepped approach that gradually and capably responds to housing needs. Because what does the next increment look like? If you live in a neighborhood of single-family homes, of which, as I drove around with Joy yesterday, I see that that's the vast majority of what is here. If you have a housing challenge, then there will be new needs and new demands for the next increment of a neighborhood to evolve to become a series of duplexes mixed in with single-family homes. It doesn't look like overwhelming amounts of growth. It looks like your neighborhood is just slightly more mature, slightly more intense. We need to allow that by right, with minimal regulatory friction. Remember what I said at the outset. No neighborhood should experience radical change. No neighborhood should become unrecognizable overnight or in a short period of time. We say this as Strong Towns, and we get a crowd of people that say, oh, you're NIMBYs, you're not in our backyard sort of types, you're standing in the way of progress. We say, no, a neighborhood should still be recognizable. Even if you move away for a decade, when you come back, it should be hopefully more mature, a better place to be, but it ought to be recognizable. But no neighborhood can be exempt from change. When we put a neighborhood under glass, or the homeowners association requires that nothing be changed, even your haircut, when we lock it in amber and say, it is done now, you can't change it, we kill it, it dies. It becomes trapped in a way that is unhealthy for us. This is why we say that every neighborhood should experience change, but none should be subjected to radical change. Because we know that the growth needs to happen within a set of parameters. It's got to be not zero. It's got to be greater than zero. but it can be cataclysmic growth that wrecks your local economics. It absolutely destroys your local market by sending housing prices up sharply when the prospect of new higher land use or new higher value land uses are introduced in overly constricted ways. And here's the problem which you'll recognize in this region. Part of the marketing brochure of this post-war kinetic growth machine is that you could have the single-family neighborhood with the two-car garage and the picket fence and the front porch and all this. You could have the American dream, and it's yours, and it'll stay with you. And in the marketing brochure, and many people's perspectives, that means it's a stable thing. But that marketing brochure is just marketing a barrage. Neighborhoods don't actually work that way. I want you to think about a party. If you throw a party, and everyone who shows up, think of someone coming into your neighborhood. If everyone shows up, whether they were specifically invited or not, if they eat and drink more than they themselves brought, you would be a fool if you didn't shut the door and bar entry to anyone else. Your party is getting worse in a hurry, and everyone who shows up only accelerates the decline. And then Dave shows up, and it gets crazy. But what do you do if you throw a party, and everyone who shows up brings more food to eat and drink than they themselves consume? Whether they were specifically invited or not. You throw the doors open as wide as possible. Everyone who shows up makes your party better, and of course, the more merrier as well. An essential feature of the housing trap that we're in, fast, subsidized, rapid growth in neighborhoods that are built all at once into a finished state to decline in near uniform ways, with no capacity to generate new investments of the kind that would add additional uses, and diversify the capacity of residents to gain wealth together while welcoming new entrants, that is a bad party. When you have a system in which more people in the neighborhood makes your neighborhood worse, you're stuck in a bad party, and you can change that. Here, maybe it's a little bit easier if you look on your handout in a moment, but in the traditional development pattern, gradual investment in a neighborhood's services followed the gradual investment in its homes and properties. But it was very different post-World War II. In post-World War II, all modern neighborhoods were built with sewer and water systems, all have police and fire departments, nearly all have libraries, parks, and other amenities. And so why is change so hard? Well, there is generally no discernible benefit to additional residents in a community of the suburban experiment. That has a deadening, chilling consequence. Because it was just given to us, where we haven't even fully funded the costs of these things, sewers and water systems and all the rest are considered just a base condition of all modern development, the ante that we demand in an affluent modern society, regardless of whether we can afford to sustain it, and we mostly can, then it means there is no benefit to anyone in adding more people. This is why I understand when someone is opposed to more neighbors, it's often for very logical reasons. More people simply means more traffic congestion, more people at the park, longer lines at the library, a 2-minute wait at the stoplight instead of 30 seconds. Well, 2 minutes, that would be like Detroit or Grand Rapids. In some places, it means neighborhoods becoming more expensive and long-term residents being pushed out. It also means taxes going up to invest in growth in other parts of the city. And my brother-in-law lives in Winnipeg, and they are proposing to invest $1 billion of city money in order to build a new highway overpass, in order to expand the areas where they can add more housing. And the question is, how is that investment going to be recouped? One of the questions that Chuck Marohn had in the mid-2000s that ultimately led him to create Strong Towns was this: why do taxes rise the fastest in cities growing the fastest? If more growth creates more of a tax base, how is it that the taxes have to go up in order to fuel that more growth? And maybe you need to stop having that growth, and then your taxes will stay lower. And he described this entire relationship as a Ponzi scheme, one where the desperation of local governments to get more growth is at odds with the rational response of residents to new growth, as they say, okay, just not in my backyard. But as our cities experience decline and tension, as frayed budgets cut back on what governments are capable of delivering, people need to be allowed to turn the bad parties in their cities, towns, and neighborhoods into good ones. The disincentives for incremental development need to be removed. And we need to allow all neighborhoods to not only grow incrementally, but to experience positive feedback as a result of that growth. This is our way to turn the ship around, to reverse course, to escape a worsening cycle. In particular, with respect to the addition of housing, we need to be opening the door to the next increment of housing and doing so in perpetuity, ideally at the local level, to unlock local opportunity and address local needs with integrity. But if necessary, to overcome political traps, to even seek to do so at the state level. I had a call from the ministerial advisor to our provincial housing minister just a couple of weeks ago. He said, in a strong towns world, what would you advise the government to do? And I said, well, only step in where necessary, but leave the majority of the power still to the local level. Leave it to the local leaders, but if need be, if you need to break certain political logjams that prevent courageous, bold leaders from stepping forward in their communities, do so at the state level or the provincial level for us. But then return the responsibility, return the control, because at the local level is where we build places. At the local level, we collaborate together to make our communities a great party that everyone benefits from as we participate in it together. I want to touch on a component of this that your community planning officers, zoning bylaw reviewers, and building officials need to be urged to take action on, to stop requiring suburban-style building setbacks. Let me explain. Is there a way to build densely where the neighbors welcome it instead of oppose it? Of course there is. If we want more density, the density we permit, though, can't look like a foreign invader. It needs to blend with the neighborhood. This is what regulations in Lethbridge, Alberta, my hometown, called for and approved as a great rental project. But the question is, how can this building ever change? How will this property thicken up or be adapted to serve more uses? It can't. It's built all at once into a finished state. And if I hadn't told you it was in my hometown of Lethbridge, you'd think I'd found it in your state or county. These are ubiquitous, complicated buildings that will break down and be difficult to salvage. Whereas this project in Washington, you'd be excused if you thought it had always been there, even though it is a very new building recently constructed. It's both reasonable and not at all difficult to require what is built here to look like a house, look like a well-mannered or well-intended place for people to live instead of bulk storage units. Allowing narrower lot sizes allows for more flexibility of design. A lot of our suburban lot dimension requirements, along with setbacks, which are also suburban in dimension, mean that we're requiring the artificial bulking up of units into one large structure and not allowing the fine-grained, compact, livable development that we need. Like most suburban codes, our code focuses on front yard setbacks, but doesn't give consideration to how these setbacks relate to adjacent properties. Urban Design 101, what we see in historical cities all over, is to line up a row of buildings with each other to at least begin to create a sense of place. This diagram by Leon Creer illustrates the difference between an urban and suburban design approach, and I want to briefly touch on this. I've changed the text here to make it slightly easier to read, and let me explain in a moment. These are 3 increments of development on the same parcels of land. On the top is the suburban or the experimental design, and below is the urban or the traditional design. And one is laid out according to modern requirements. We have to check your code. You're probably in the upper section. In the realm of, as I said, the experimental, never before attempted effort to build neighborhoods. The lower portion is the traditional way that cities and towns grew. Thousands of years of trial and error to create a system that provides stability, security, wealth-building opportunities, and housing supplies that respond more quickly to housing demands and adapt when that housing demands subside through conversions up and down the steps of household occupancy. Here's that image I showed you in Grand Rapids. I want you to keep that image in mind as I describe Leon Creer's observations. You see, setbacks in suburban development require you to build away from the boundaries of your land. I always say, I could say this as a Canadian, how's that for freedom and property rights, eh? Do we have to be building only in a particular part of the plate and not being allowed to use the land that you have? Lot requirements also, in the second component, blur the question of what's mine and what's ours. As any Jehovah's Witness on your doorstep, or Christine's dog who uses your town or your lawn as a porta potty will show you. It's not clear where the boundary between public and private begins and ends. And this is the biggest factor that explains the gut level reaction to the third component there on the bottom left, Many people have this gut reaction to new construction in their neighborhoods, particularly multifamily housing projects that are introduced within existing single-family neighborhoods in the suburban experiment. It's the sense that growth increases the feeling of disorder and clutter. In contrast, a build-to line with consideration to adjacent properties would be far more productive than our current setback approach. And I don't wish, expect, or believe that we should even attempt to regulate beautiful-looking buildings into existence. Yet what makes a building fit into a neighborhood has little to do with adornment or style and everything to do with building bulk, placement, and orientation, how it addresses the street, and we need to regulate this well. There is nothing requiring high-density construction to be ugly except for our own ordinances. Cities need to allow neighborhoods to thicken up, to evolve, to mature over time. And to do this, they need to get the zoning bylaws back on side with traditional patterns of development. It's a standby line for us that if your community's heritage area burned down, could you rebuild what was there without having to get a zoning variance? My brother-in-law in Winnipeg wrote a whole article about his neighborhood, calling it a neighborhood full of illegals. He said if we had a fire, it would destroy the walk-up apartment, it would destroy the duplex, it would destroy the accessory dwelling units in the backyard. And the trouble is, under the current down-zoned application of the zoning bylaw in their community, none of that could be reconstructed. A bulk of their neighbors would have to simply leave because there would only be allowed one household per property. How have we done this to ourselves? Why have we done this? It's because we got ourselves caught up in a housing trap, began to adapt all of our systems and to be very complicated. It is complicated to build a city, but we lost the complex adaptive capacity that we need in order to get this right. Instead, we need to simplify our land use regulations down to the essentials necessary to get good urban form in the next increment of development intensity. Get the form right and everything else will work itself out over time. We also have to be very intentional about lowering the bar of entry, to consciously go out and try to make it easier for people to get started. I said at the beginning, when I said that the traditional development pattern was rich people surrounded by poor people. And I acknowledge the implications of that. They're not all good, but some of them are good. And one of the good ones is that you can start with very little. And by working with your neighbors in your place, you end up with something more than what you started with. We need to get back to having that opportunity available to people. And so we need to lower the bar of entry. We need to have an entry point for people that they can get into. A question for you. How many of you would like to live in a 600 square foot house? Put up your hand if you would like to live in a 600 square foot house. Oh, there's no renters here. Okay, a few of you, yes. Now another question, how many of you have lived in a 600 square foot house? That's right. And so we need this low bar of entry. We see how that changes the situation dramatically. This little building here is what is now called a tiny house with special rules and regulations to be followed in order to exist or conform within an existing neighborhood zoning bylaw and then get extra permission under forms A through Z that you have to file with the local inspector and go and ask permission from your neighbors. And you say, how did we get to this point? The city of Delta, where I live, we have two tiny home manufacturers, which if you spend any time on YouTube, you should definitely watch Tiny Home Journals. But they're not allowed to place any of them within the city where they are being constructed because of our archaic, outdated planning bylaws. And so, what is a starter home? Well, it's when we build something modest within our means. When we save a little bit of money, we then add an addition. When we have a kid, we put on a second story. The neighbor comes over and helps you to go over, and you go over and help them. We're nostalgic about that, but we make it so hard to do. And we do things like that all the time. This is the building block or ladder of prosperity that we've taken that lower rung off, and we've said it's not possible to do. And ironically, as Chuck Marone points out in all the places he visits, while we've raised the bar on that entry-level product, we've also dramatically lowered the bar on the mid-level. Most single-family homes today are built of cheap, throwaway material that quickly falls apart once it reaches the end of its life cycle. That applies to residential as well as commercial construction. It's too expensive to tear down and replace, but too cheap to last. Instead, we need to lower the bar of entry And when we lower the bar of entry, we actually invite more people to participate in building our city. What would the market produce if we eliminated existing barriers to building homes, particularly at the low end? And if we also eliminate powerful policy inducements to land speculation? It'd be very different from what the market produces now. A few of the barriers that we need to address. Mandatory parking minimums. We're campaigning to end them. We need to stop with this. Mandatory minimum lot sizes. Building code requirements that preclude cheaper and better ways of designing buildings. Design requirements that do the same. Uncertainty and delays that we've built into our development approval process, which increases risk and ties up capital. These barriers limit who gets to develop housing. It shuts out incremental developers who can't bear the risk and added costs. In fact, it skews things in favor of bigger corporate developers who throw their weight around and are hyper-attentive to their bottom line. When you have a situation where more like 40% of the population can't really afford market rents, the task of finding the subsidy to accommodate that tsunami of need becomes almost impossible. And as a result, fights over whom housing is for become far uglier and more zero-sum. As I said, one critical action that moves us toward our North Star of a traditional time-tested development pattern is to allow the next increment of development universally, so that every neighborhood is capable of adding housing and absorbing pent-up demand. This would reduce the premium paid for developable lots, and not to mention the monopoly rents commanded by landlords who own the existing housing in a place where it's illegal to add more, and so they can charge more. Another option to consider is a land value tax. Another place to do this is to remove parking minimums, as I said, not in negotiations or to do a solid for a nonprofit, just do so up front. Allow social housing and market housing to become easier to build, to finance, and sustain. Take actions to allow accessory dwelling units, structures to be built within existing single-family neighborhoods, and no longer considering those neighborhoods to be exclusively single-family. Lower minimum lot sizes. Lot size requirements force houses to consume more land than residents might otherwise want. It's so clear that this drives up costs. Land is such a major cost in the building of a home that a large minimum lot size can substantially increase the cost of housing. What else can we do? We can allow residential development in our commercial zones. Allow it by right, not just in spot zone centers where you get some particular planning exemption. No, instead make it just standard that if you can stick an apartment on top of a store, you're allowed to do it. If you can stick an apartment in your city hall, you can do it. Well, talk to your mayor first before you try, but to make progress on these types of things. And critically also, to create the conditions for a more thriving community, allow commercial in residential areas. The conversion of a front story, or a floor, a front area into a store to allow the next increment of commercial activity to blur together with these things. We had a question that came up in the office hour session that we were doing a month ago, where someone said, instead of talking about subsidized housing, can we please start talking about income-producing housing as an option for those that are middle class or low class? Creating opportunities for people to generate income within their homes. And we already know this happens. I work from home, others work from home. We have small craft businesses, but there are more opportunities for doing this. This is even where, I know it's controversial, but things like Airbnbs and vacation rentals are a way for existing homeowners when they live in their home to generate additional income from that home. I won't talk about the people that come from Grand Rapids or Canada, but we could definitely talk about those that live here and need opportunities to generate income in order to provide for what they need. Allow commercial uses in what is considered residential neighborhoods. That's just a fiction on a map, and yet we have allowed it to persist. We need to speed up the discretionary review process. I'll go easy on city staff with this. We'll give a floor area bump for desirable developments. Provide opportunities for the recognition. If you're going to construct something that is desirable within our community, you can expect this amount of an increase in your allowable density. We could actually just get rid of floor area ratios and use maximum site coverage rules and we'd be fine. But if you have to, consider ways that you can index the things that you want with the things that you will provide in terms of a bump. And these are just a handful of the steps that can be taken to return us to a path that leads us out of the housing trap. The big macro level economic processes will still pose a major blockade. which is why we temper our expectations and commit to working at this over generations. The big financial part of it is going to be extremely difficult to solve, but the things that I just outlined, those things are ways in which we correct for the suburban experiment. Because what we have is that we have cities and towns that are not very productive, and we don't make enough use of the stuff we've built. And we need to go in and make better use of the roads we have, the pipes we have, the drainage systems we have, and make better use of this all. The cities that we've built today, the model that we've built them in, is a bad business model. It doesn't work, and it doesn't work for people. We've all maybe found a niche, a way to make it work, but I walk around and I'm saddened because it could be so much better. We don't lack the money. We don't lack the resources. We don't lack the imagination. But the current trap makes us feel like we do, but we don't. We're spending a ridiculous amount of resources, a ridiculous amount of time on things that are not building our wealth, are not building our prosperity, are not giving our people a better quality of life. But we can reorient ourselves, reorient the way that we think about these issues and create these complex feedback loops that we respond to. And at the end of the day, spend less, get more, and live better lives. That's what Strong Towns is all about. And thank you for this opportunity to share about this.
Can we get another mic so that we can have a mic on each side of the room? Thank you so much, Norm. Man, I was on the edge of my chair. I did have an opportunity to give Norm a little tour yesterday, so we did drive around. We are getting another mic, so one of us will be on each side of the room. If you have questions, we're going to have about 10 minutes for questions. And I want to remind you, on your table there's a blue sheet and a white sheet. The white sheet is for you to make comments on that you want to take home with you and thoughts that you may want to save for our final session. The blue sheet, if the table leaders or others of you have information that you want to share with us as we put that last session together, please leave your blue sheet in the basket in front of the podium, or bring it with you next week at our next session, and you can put it there then. So at this point, anybody have a burning question that they would like to ask Norm? Hands up if you do.
Thank you, Joy. Hi, good morning. I'm Stephanie with the Village of Spring Lake, local government representative. So thank you for coming here. I've been following Strong Towns for a while. As a homeowner and millennial, I think you touched on duplexes, which I've seen they used to be popular but have kind of fallen off, and we've gone down into the hole of HOAs, condos. How do we kind of bring that back to that concept to allow more opportunity for renters with duplexes over HOAs and condo ownership?
It's a great question, because one of the challenges is that you're dealing with a fourth level of government that is quite content to remain in place as a fourth level, and it feels very disruptive to say, okay, no more HOAs. If that's not the approach, one of the most significant things that the city of Lafayette did was they began to change the way that property taxes were assessed based on the degree of service intensity required. And so if you were a certain distance away from where services were being provided, sewer, water, and things like that, you would pay a greater rate for those costs. We do this with transit systems where you pay a one-zone fare to go a certain distance, a two-zone fare, and a three-zone fare. That would be one of the ways to approach it, where they would then, I'm assuming an HOA around a golf course, large sprawling lots, nobody's admitted, no one else is allowed to enter. They're quite content, quite happy, kind of want to just leave things as they are. But the challenge, and what we found, I didn't have the slides today, but the data shows that these neighborhoods are being subsidized by the more compact neighborhood development. And so one of the things to do that is to begin to push people where it hurts, where there are many HOAs that have ceased to exist after a certain point. So for a couple generations, the HOA is firmly entrenched and in charge, and Brother Jerry is the one that rules with an iron fist. But then after a certain amount of time, you will see neighborhoods that opt out of an HOA, or entire blocks that will do it. And part of it is because all of those additional restrictions hamper that complex adaptiveness that we need. In the short term, we also would say there probably are neighborhoods that are going to resist any kind of change, and at some level you may need to simply just avoid them. There is so much more that can be done within existing neighborhoods. The trouble is that in that setting, you want to basically create the conditions by which, as soon as there is movement within the HOA, as well as I think some work of persuasion. Some of the people that have joined our local housing advocacy group are seniors. They own property, but they're like, I don't want to have to go visit my kids in Regina, Saskatchewan. Like, I want them to live around me, and that can be an opportunity. Another effective way is people have said, no renters. And you have a question with them, say, well, did you rent when you were in college? And they say, well, yeah. Would you have liked to live in this neighborhood? Well, point taken. And that can sometimes be the way to try to change that. But there's a perception as well, and it's been debunked, but facts are challenging to integrate into the narrative that people tell themselves, is that housing, new types of housing, more density, townhouses, duplexes, that sort of stuff, lowers your property value. It does not. This has been shown again and again and again. But there's a perception that it lowers something different than house value, and people will struggle with how to articulate that, so they default. It's my house price is going to go down if there's a duplex next to me because, there goes the neighborhood. And you say, this is a delightful neighborhood, and there now will be more liveliness within it. Another challenge is that a lot of HOAs are designed in ways that, and this is very suburban styled, but it's found its way back into our cities too, that homes are designed and oriented in ways to try to limit conflicts between neighbors. And so everything faces the street. There's very little interactions, large yards, expectations of fences. And ironically, that has not done anything to deal with human nature and limit the amounts of human conflicts within suburbs. And yet, it has also created a situation, which was the Leon Cryer slide, where it feels very disordered, very disruptive to add any kind of additional things unless you have super large lots and somebody's building a house for their pool or a house for their golf cart or a house for everything that they hunt and bring home with them. But like for people, it's like, no, that's too disruptive. And so that's an element of it. HOAs are definitely tricky because, it's a fourth level of government that is, you can only advocate around and with when you are within it. And it's sort of like a zoning hearing where we will often say, we're here to speak for the people that haven't moved in yet. We're here to speak for the person that just needs to move into this neighborhood from another neighborhood within our city. Or we're here to speak for the young college student that's about to graduate. And they're not here yet because they're still finishing their papers. But once they get here, we want them to be here. We want them to invest. And that can be sometimes the work of persuasion as well. There will be, groups that are hard to persuade, but that's where we say it's generational as well. It's going to take some time. I do think that the value of an HOA weakens and drops as the years go by. It's best when it's bright, shiny, and new, but over time, some of the debates, some of the fights, some of the conflicts result in people exiting, and that can sometimes be a fertile opportunity for that. Yeah.
Any other? Hadley, you want to get that one?
Thank you for that, Norm. I really appreciate the talk and everything. My name is Kevin Austin. I'm the zoning administrator for Georgetown Township.
Right.
So a little further east here. I live in, or I work in the city where there isn't a traditional development footprint. It's very much post-World War II. It is a proudly self-proclaimed bedroom community where there are what would be considered highways in many other places in the world and in the country, arterials that their function is to get me to my work in Grand Rapids or somewhere else and get me back. I call them scalpels. I think they're stroads is what they are. And I don't think that they're very productive. And I'm starting to have these conversations with some of the staff and things like that. And I've been getting into strong towns more in the past year or so. But I'm looking for the approach that, that incremental approach that I don't think, when people look at it and they look at, okay, we're looking for the traditional footprint that you're saying we need to reemphasize. And it's not here because we developed as a farming community, and then post-World War II, bam. We're here, we've got our arterials, we've got Chicago Drive, Baldwin, and a connection to the highway. So I'm trying to figure out the incremental approach, and I believe your list at the end there probably really provided quite a few, but maybe if you reiterate just to hammer that home for me, that incremental approach, because they look at a downtown, and we have a community like Ada Township that just built a downtown out of nowhere, and it is booming. And it is, people are buying up apartments nearby because they want to be in that social environment, they want to be in that footprint. So I'm looking for that incremental bit, because like you said, it should not be subject to radical change.
Right.
So I'm trying to look for that next phase, or that small move that we can make that makes sense to them, because the financial side makes sense, but they don't see it yet. But it is a palpable change that makes sense, and that works for something that doesn't have a traditional development footprint.
Yeah. Certainly, you're in it. You're right in the thick of that challenge, especially when you have very ingrained transportation habits where people just assume that this is what it takes to live here. Why would we change it? One of the things to consider is to broaden the scope of what constitutes your commercial area. So if there is a corridor that has some commercial onto it, rather than orienting all that commercial with residential on top on that corridor, instead find those little seams that run off of it, the little seams that run parallel to it or perpendicular to it, and basically identify those as your core nodes. And what you can create is, if you imagine like a big cross, if this is your big fast road running through, if you can create the slow street that runs here, it means you have one critical intersection where you can do things to slow cars, you can do things to create a better opportunity for pedestrians, leading pedestrian intervals to improve pedestrian safety, because they're crossing probably a 6-lane strode at that point, or at least 4 lanes. But the challenge will be those immediate properties. Some of the things that you might do is their property is already somewhat degraded by being so close to the strode. And so there may be opportunities even for either an innovative local investor to take some of those parcels and turn them into fine-grained lots to do some sort of innovative things, if they have the assurance, hey, we've cleared the deck for you. We've made this possible, not just as a favor, but as a new standing policy, to create basically you don't want commercial, the whole idea of allowing commercial within existing residential areas is to allow for that type of income-producing housing. But in this sort of setting where you're trying to create something, you might consider that type of an approach that says, let's not do any of our development on the major thoroughfare. Let's return that in a sense to its state as a road, but then allow for, there's a lot of pleasant left-hand turns and right-hand turns into all of a sudden, I did not know that they had done this. Now it's there. And you create a little nucleus. And when you have that, I look at the Grand Rapids picture where you have these little nuclei. And one of the fascinating things, if you've visited many larger cities, is you will typically see these types of clusters about a 15 minutes walk from each other. 15 to 30 minutes roughly. And it would basically be that you would walk into the neighborhood to get the things that you need. This is before, or ride your horse, but you would walk in. But at some point, it became advantageous to start a new one. And one of the odd things about our system is that we allow a lot of our suburbs to lack these core things where you would say there's a great opportunity to get something started. But you need just that little bit of initial work to make that happen. Another challenge or opportunity could be, is there any way to relocate maybe some of the municipal work so that a planning office has a space for a cafe? You put that in a place that you want to recreate. Those are the small bets that you can do within a city context. But if you check your zoning code, I would imagine there's quite a rigid distinction of uses. And you might say within a certain perimeter or a periphery of these areas, what if we just, as an experiment, broaden it out and see what we can say? If these homes become available to be converted, so you keep the house, but you change the use. Nothing changes in terms of the built form, but what you create is a new node of economic opportunity. And with that, in time, you would want your community to take pride and say, we are more than a bedroom community. We are a place worth visiting, not just a place. Think about it. Spending 8 hours of that time with your eyes closed, not even observing anything, is less of an experience of that as a place. People love their weekends. They love that. But you can say we can add other components that will build your quality of life and pay the bills. So there might be some financial stuff to do as well to say, hey, this is actually what our real financial problem is compared with what everyone's perceived understanding of the financial problem is. Your communities probably have to post a balanced budget each year, and yet municipal accounting allows for a lot of pushing things under the rug, deferring maintenance, selling off city assets in order to be able to balance the budget yet again. And we have this in our city, that we have a far more skimpy tax base than we should, given the size of the land that we take up.
I think in order to have some table conversation, because we've heard comments back from all of you that the shortened time with table conversation really has kind of impeded some of the ideas to come forward. So, as Karen would say, Dave is our facilitator, and I think that Karen, I'm going to turn the mic over to you, but Karen would give like 2 or 3 minutes for you to kind of think on your own, write some things down, and then Dave will give you instructions for table conversation.
Is this on? I'm going to immediately change that and just say I think you've had a lot of time to think, and I'm going to just encourage you to jump right into conversations and take some notes on your blue sheets as you do that. Definitely a very interesting topic and a lot to talk about. So I'm going to encourage you to go ahead, jump into those conversations, and for those who are table hosts, you start those conversations, take notes, and then we're going to start hearing from you in a few minutes from the conversations at your tables. Be able to hear from all of the tables, but I want to encourage you to use those blue sheets and to take some notes on those, to put them up here in the basket. Those are going to be invaluable notes, so please make sure you capture as much as you can on those notes. So now we're going to give an opportunity to hear from a few tables, and we will try to be fair, and we'll go from one side to the other so that we can't be blamed for picking favorite sides. Are you raising your hand? Right away. All right.
Yes. So I think when I came in today, I said our conversations always end up back to housing. So every one of these sessions end up back at housing. And one of the things we talked about was we have to start having those conversations about what our communities aspire to be. But we all had listened to the presentation and all the great ideas, but how do we actually change that mindset to want to do that? So to us, that's, to me personally, but I think that's a conversation we had at our table, is how do we get that mindset to look differently at things? How do we educate the community? Because our board members represent the community, and they try to do what the community believes we should do. So how do we get the community on board to make the changes that we need to make that housing affordable and to have that growth happen? So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to suggest let's hold our applause, and we'll give everyone applause at the end to keep our time going. So let's hear from a table on this side of the room. Or the middle of the room. Or over here. Okay, gave you an opportunity.
I will just piggyback on what was just said, because we talked a little bit about objection to density and changing things that have been. And maybe the best thing that clicked with me was something Josh said, and that is narratives win out over numbers. Personally, for me, that would mean we had a community that my kids would be able to come back and live in. It might be different for someone else, but narratives win over numbers.
There's a good quote for the day. Another table will come over here.
We talked a lot, I think, at our group about the fact that we think Grand Haven did a pretty good job at the beginning of the building up and the building in, and then we have lost that somewhere along the way. And how do we bring in more of that, and how do we build our communities so that the young people sitting at our table can ever afford to come back? Because right now they can't. So how do we look at that, and how do we build that, and where does it start? And is that cross connections on either side of our town? Is that connections with Spring Lake and us? Do we need more multifamily housing? How does that look, and what do we do to move forward with that?
Great questions. Headley, you got to stir up some interest on your side there.
I'm going to piggyback a little bit on that, because we talked a little bit about like generational and the first time home buyer, and how the economics of when you sell a house, you're going to go to the highest bidder. And the highest bidder might be a cash offer, and that's probably not a young person. So how do you incentivize the economics of selling a home to somebody who is an entry-level buyer? And that's not something that somebody who's selling a home might do because they're incentivized to go to the highest bidder. So how do you change that, and how do you incentivize it so that the economics are in the favor of somebody who's not an investor with cash?
And I might just add, the realtor might have some incentive in how that goes too. You had your chance, Hadley.
Well, I think this is a good opportunity for our table to chime in and follow that and focus on Grand Haven's use of the Community Land Trust in finding a balance between the complicated and complex, incentivizing but still having that private sector buy-in. I think that might be where we're stuck, is that we are in this complicated process we've built, and getting out of that without collateral damage by hurting people or finances or the economy is going to be very, very difficult. So that might be kind of a stepping stone back towards, you know, the complexity that works and away from the complicatedness that doesn't. And we had a lot of other good comments at our table, but I'll just share because I know the time is short.
Other tables. I'll let you have that one, Hadley. You need your steps today, right?
Can you hear me?
Very interesting sitting with the Village of Spring Lake, Township of Grand Haven, City of Grand Haven, and myself as the Executive Director of the People Center, who provides housing for people who face some sort of housing crisis. And I'm just a little peon in Spring Lake, live in Grand Haven. Whatever we're doing, it's not working, and I'm seeing a lot of people living in their cars. We need to figure it out. I've tried for 24 years to try to figure it out. I don't know the answers. I really feel like maybe this room can help, and I loved what this guy was saying.
I'm looking at the clock, Hadley, and I think we're at that point where we need to draw things together. I will just give one little thing from my own experience, and that is for each of us to start taking a look at what is it that we can do in our own space. In that, what decisions can we make? How can we help to bring people into the market? And I think if we get creative, we can find that individuals can have an impact, and not that we don't have to totally rely on the government to have to figure it out for us.
Thank you. Wonderful discussion and comments. Thank you all for being here and being part of this today. As a reminder, the blue sheets, we have a basket up here. If you could leave those in the basket, we will compile them. Definitely hope to continue this conversation. As someone said, it keeps circling back to housing. Housing has been a topic, a need within this community for many years. A lot of forward progress has been made, but there's a lot of work to continue. So thank you for being part of the conversation. Want to recognize the team at the Chamber of Grand Haven, Spring Lake, Ferrysburg, as well as the Grand Haven Area Community Foundation. Thank you for everything that happens behind the scenes in making this happen, and thank you for everyone attending. So the next session, May 16th, and then followed with the wrap-up of bringing everything together the following week, May 23rd. So have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.